Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
The war of words between the Prime Minister and Scotland's First Minister showed no sign of abating today as both leaders addressed their parties' conferences this weekend. The pair started trading blows after Ms Sturgeon called on Monday for a second referendum on independence for Scotland to be held between autumn 2018 and spring 2019 in light of the Brexit vote. Ms Sturgeon was first to launch an attack, saying she had been met with a brick wall of intransigence from Westminster. But Theresa May was quick to retaliate, accusing the SNP of tunnel vision and playing politics with the future of our country. After suggestions that the Prime Minister could block the referendum until after the 2021 Holyrood elections, the First Minister shot back on Twitter, saying, "I was elected as FM on a clear manifesto commitment, #ScotRef. Prime Minister is not yet elected by anyone." That didn't seem to faze Mrs May. She used an interview yesterday to repeat her view that now is not the time for a referendum, saying it would be unfair to Scotland to hold one before Brexit negotiations are concluded. But Ms Sturgeon described the Prime Minister's attitude as a democratic outrage and insisted that it will be Scotland's choice. We're joined now from the SNP Spring Conference in the granite city of Aberdeen by the party's Deputy Leader, Angus Robertson. Angus Robertson, the First Minister wants a referendum before the spring of 2019, when the whole Article 50 process should come to an end. The Prime Minister says no, not one until at least until after the Brexit process is done and dusted. What happens next?
Well, I think it's important to unpick what that means, because the Prime Minister, and this is where it gets a bit confusing, she says that there shouldn't be a referendum in Scotland now. Now the time is not right. And I agree with her, and the Scottish Government is not proposing to hold a referendum now because, of course, the negotiations are about to start. And the Scottish Government has also said that it makes sense for people in Scotland to know what the outcome of the Brexit negotiations are. And to that extent, there's not a disagreement at all. And what confuses me somewhat is apparently the British Government wants to create the impression that it's okay for Parliament, so the British Parliament, the European Parliament, other European governments, to agree to the deal on Brexit, but somehow people in Scotland are going to be denied that choice. And I think what's actually happening at the moment is that the Tories are trying to suggest that they're a bit intransigent, but they're not actually saying that they're ruling out a referendum. And so I think it's really important for people to understand the timescales that are involved, because we agree the UK government should be able to proceed with negotiations. There is, of course, a mandate in England and Wales for Brexit, but it would be unfair to people in Scotland to be denied a choice before the UK actually leaves. And they're supposed to be 6 months before the end of Brexit negotiations.
Sure, I haven't got much time, Mr Robertson, so I'd be appreciative if we could just keep the answers brief, as you will appreciate. There's been some stories going on here in London this morning. I'm going to ask for your reaction.
I was about to say, am I going to be offered a job editing the Daily Politics?
Oh, you may well be, because you ought to see the crew we have at the moment, Mr Robertson. I mean, honestly.
I still pay my membership to the National Union of Journalists as well. I don't think George Osborne's ever done that.
You could well be right on that one. You or Mrs Sturgeon are assuming that we will know the nature of the Brexit deal by the autumn of 2018. But you also know the way Europe works. Sometimes these things could go down to the wire. They may stop the clock at the 11th hour in spring. If we don't know the nature of the Brexit deal until the very last minute, when would you then have the referendum?
Well, that can't happen. It simply can't happen for the reason that there needs to be approval in the UK and in the EU and amongst the member states. So you're right, often things overrun in a European context, but there has to be a period, and whether that is negotiated within the 2-year period which the Article 50 process is supposed to start, or whether there is some sort of extension, one way or the other, there has to be a period for parliaments to agree the deal and the European institutions to agree the deal. And it's just a simple, basic democratic point that if there is a period for decision making, then not not only should parliaments in Britain and Europe be able to decide on our future, but voters in Scotland should be able to decide too. And we're Democrats, and we think, given the First Minister was elected with a mandate, something the Prime Minister doesn't have on this question, that there should be a referendum with a change of circumstances like Scotland potentially being taken out of the EU against our will, then that's exactly what should happen.
You are a Democrat, so therefore you will know that the ability to call a referendum is a reserved power for Westminster. If Westminster does not approve that within the time scale that you want, would you consider calling an advisory referendum in Scotland?
Well, I think the really important thing to bear in mind is that this is going to be decided on in the Scottish Parliament next week.
Yeah, I understand that.
I think people need to understand how to... Well, I'm not sure all of your viewers will understand that there is actually going to be a vote in the Scottish Parliament next week as to whether there should be an independence referendum. And I think some people don't understand how incendiary it would be for a UK government to then overrule Scotland's democratically elected Parliament and its government that has a mandate on this question. And as I said before, the Prime Minister has said that now is not the time for a referendum. We agree, we don't plan to hold a referendum now.
What's the answer to my question, Mr. Robertson? Will you call an advisory referendum if you don't get Westminster's agreement?
That is not my plan. My plan and the Scottish Government's plan is to make sure the UK government lives up to its democratic responsibilities, that if we are in a union that is a partnership of equals, they have to respect Scotland's Parliament. And if Scotland's Parliament votes for there to be a referendum, if the Prime Minister wants to continue to claim that the United Kingdom is based on respect, then she must respect that decision. If not, the claims are shown to be totally empty.
But there was a time when you and Mrs. Sturgeon used to talk about there had to be the clear will of the Scottish people to have a second referendum. Now, you had a second referendum in your manifesto on the conditions that you said. There will probably next week be a majority in the Scottish Parliament, but there is no evidence it is the clear will of the Scottish people to have a second referendum.
So, just hold on a second. So, you're just stressing, and quite rightly so, that the Scottish Government was elected with a manifesto commitment. I know UK governments think they can break these things willy-nilly, but in Scotland it still matters. And our government was elected with more votes than the Labour Party and the Conservative Party combined in Scotland. And you're suggesting that if Scotland's Parliament votes that there should be a referendum, that somehow a UK government can ignore that.
No, I'm not suggesting. I'm asking you a question, Mr. Wright. I'm asking a question. You're tap dancing round it.
If you would let me finish, Andrew.
Well, I'd like you to answer the question instead of going off on a tangent.
No, this is actually right at the heart of the matter. I think people in Whitehall and Westminster need to understand that if they disregard Scotland's Parliament, a majority voting in favour of Scotland having a referendum, and they are then going to go on to say that Scotland not only cannot have a referendum now, but it must take even more years, and Scotland will have left the European Union by then. The consequences for the United Kingdom is that there will not be a United Kingdom.
Let me come back.
Because the fiction of respect
let me come
will
back
have
to
been
my question.
exposed as being totally empty.
Let me have one more chance at trying to get you to address the actual question that I asked you. Because I used to talk to SNP politicians and activists, and they used to say, look, we need clear evidence in the opinion polls that Scotland wants another referendum. As John Curtis has said, a number of recent polls have all produced the same answer. Around 50% say there should not be a pre-Brexit referendum. A third and 2/5 say there should. So it is not a clear will of the Scottish people, as yet, to have a second referendum.
I'm terribly sorry, Andrew, but you've only read out from part of the SNP manifesto then, and you should have
I was reading from John Curtis.
The point that said that if there is a material change in circumstances and Scotland faces being taken out of the European Union against its will, that is a material change of circumstances, and there should be a referendum.
I'm not arguing with that,
and
Mr.
that
Robertson.
Manifesto, and that, look, I'm not talking about opinion polls here. When the Scottish people had a vote on this issue, they voted for an SNP government on the basis of that manifesto, not opinion polls.
I'm not arguing about that.
Actual votes, and in a democracy, when people are elected to do that, that's exactly what they should do, and that's what the SNP plans to do.
Can you give us evidence that as opinion stands at now in Scotland, that the Scottish people want a second referendum. Where is the evidence that there's a majority among the Scottish people for a second referendum?
Andrew, as you well know, there are a range of polls, some of them showing that people want a referendum now.
Not
some
one
of them
shows
saying
a
they
majority
want a
for
referendum
that.
later, and some of them saying they don't want a referendum at all. But Andrew, our political system is not based on opinion polls, it's based on real votes. And in Scotland we had a real vote, and the people decided to elect a Scottish government led by the SNP with a cast iron manifesto on this very issue. That is Scotland's government at the present time, and Scotland's government intends to make a proposal to the Scottish Parliament, and the Parliament is likely to vote for this. This is much more important than opinion polls, some of which politicians like.
Well,
and some
except
of
that
which
your party
politicians
used to
don't
talk
like. I'm
about
talking
opinion
real
polls.
votes.
Your
Real
party used to
votes.
say
Real
several
votes.
leading SNP
Real votes matter, Andrew.
several leading SNP members said to me, we really couldn't have a second referendum until there was a clear 60-40 majority in the polls for having one. It's not me saying that, maybe not you saying that, but that used to be what you argue, and I'm simply saying now to you, there is no evidence that's the case so far.
Yeah, no, I'm sorry, there is evidence that people faced with the prospect of Scotland being taken out of the European Union against the will of people here, and it hasn't been mentioned so far, but 62% of voters in Scotland voted to remain within the European Union in these circumstances, and it was expressly in the SNP manifesto the Scottish Government would proceed with plans for the people of Scotland to be able to choose on the subject.
Okay.
And well, you keep on saying you understand, and then you question it.
No, I ask a different matter, Mr. Robertson, and you keep on answering a question that I'm not asking. So I think we'll both quit while we're not ahead. We'll better leave it there. Mr. Robertson, thank you very much. Where's this all going to go?
Well, at the moment, it seems to me that Theresa May has managed to rearm the SNP, who actually have been facing considerable problems domestically with how they've been administering the government of Scotland on all sorts of policy areas.
What's the evidence for that, though? There's no sign in the polls that Brexit has been a game changer on Scottish opinion. Both the demand for a second referendum or how the Scots may vote in a second referendum, Brexit itself hasn't really moved the dial on that.
You can't deny them their excuse about it having materially changed.
Well, there's no question about that.
Absolutely,
That's not the. But that's for the SNP. What I'm saying is there's quite a lot of focus group work being done in Scotland at the moment, and what they're finding is that the prospect of endless Tory governments in Westminster, they don't like. That's a worry. But Brexit, single market, customs union, none of that has moved the dial.
But this is a fantastic tactical move for the SNP, is it not, to distract attention back onto the whole issue of process about a second referendum, because they can portray the London government blocking the will of the Scottish people, and that is something that plays very well for them. I think that the thing about the SNP is they're very good at strategy, but they're even better at tactics. And tactically, they can build this into another grievance against London, which in the long run, even if not in the short run, will help them in their eventual goal.
Okay. Now, in the last few minutes, the Prime Minister has been addressing the issue of a referendum in Scotland, that we've just been talking about. This is what she had to say in her speech to the Conservative Spring Conference a few minutes ago.
And we've seen that tunnel vision on display again this week. The SNP argue that we should break up the UK because we are leaving the EU. But 3 years ago, they campaigned for a result that would have taken Scotland out of the EU altogether. They're happy to see power rest in Brussels, but if those powers come back to London, they want them given to Edinburgh so they can try and give them back to Brussels.
And the Conservative MSP, Murdo Fraser, joins us now from Dundee. Murdo Fraser, the SNP put into their manifesto, on which they won to form a government, that if there was a material change, there should be a second referendum. There has clearly been a material change, so they're entirely within their rights to call a second referendum.
Well, of course, the SNP don't have a majority in the Scottish Parliament. They went into the Scottish Parliament election with a majority, and they lost their majority on that very manifesto that you mentioned about. And of course, we had a vote in 2014. It's not even 3 years since we had a referendum.
But there's been a material
change. We had a very high turnout. Well, let's remember in 2014 we knew there was an EU referendum in prospect. We knew that was happening. It was mentioned in the SNP's white paper. But even if we accept the material change argument, the SNP do not have a majority in the Scottish Parliament. They lost their majority based upon their manifesto.
But there is a
What they're having to
majority
do
in the Scottish
in advance of the
Parliament
vote-
for a second referendum. You have a, I mean,
Well-
you say they don't have a majority. The whole system was designed not to give anybody a majority, but for a period the SNP did. And with the Green Party, there is a majority in the Parliament. The Greens are a pro-independence party too. They also talked about a change with Brexit. They're a pro-Europe party too. The Scottish Parliament is entirely within its rights to call for another referendum, is it not?
Well, two things. First of all, the 6 Green members were not elected on that basis. They were elected on a manifesto that said they would have to get 1 million signatures on a petition before they would support another referendum. Now, that has not been met. But there's another point here about the Scottish Parliament, and I couldn't but smile listening to your interview with Angus Robertson, who, of course, doesn't sit in the Scottish Parliament, but you think might pay attention as Deputy Leader of the SNP as to what's going on. Because the SNP government in Edinburgh routinely ignore and dismiss votes in the Scottish Parliament when they lose them. Just last week, they lost a vote on education. 2 weeks ago, they lost 2 votes. They lost a vote a few weeks ago on the Offensive Behaviour at Football Act. What happens to the Scottish government when they lose votes in the Scottish Parliament? They ignore them. And now they've got the arrogance and temerity to say that the UK government has to listen to votes in the Scottish Parliament when the SNP Scottish government ignore votes in the Scottish Parliament. You couldn't make it up. And Angus Robertson seemed to be completely ignorant.
Well,
of
what
that
bit of
fact.
the 2016 SNP manifesto don't you understand? It said clearly, we believe that the Scottish Parliament should have the right to hold another referendum if there is a significant and material change in the circumstances that prevailed in 2014, such as Scotland being taken out of the EU against our will. And that's exactly what has happened. So why are you complaining that, I mean, I know that your party's had a bit of problems delivering its manifesto recently, but they're delivering what they promised in their manifesto.
And of course, that is the manifesto on which they fought an election, which they went into with a parliamentary majority and came out having lost their majority. And let's be absolutely clear.
They got 46.5% of the vote, Mr. Fraser.
But
You
they didn't
got
get a
half that.
majority.
You got
People
half
in
that.
Scotland, people in Scotland, and our votes more than doubled. As you know, our seats more than doubled in the Scottish Parliament. People in Scotland do not want another referendum. It is a distraction from the important business that the SNP need to be getting on with, sorting out the mess they made of the Scottish economy, of education, of the health service, and of the justice system.
Right.
That's what they need to be doing.
I
And people
understand.
do not take kindly to this distraction.
Well, we will see.
Going down the route
We
of
will
another
see how
referendum.
opinion goes with this standoff on that, and it certainly will be interesting to see whether the Scottish people balk at the idea of Westminster stopping it, or whether they don't care as much as Mr. Robertson would have us believe. But what is your position? What is the Tory position? Is it the timing of a second referendum that you object to, or the very principle of a second referendum?
Well, what Theresa May made clear yesterday is that we are not saying no, not ever. What we're saying is not now. The time is not right. The case has not been made for another
But
referendum.
if not now and not ever, then when? Between now and never, when?
Well, what we have to do is have an informed decision. The people of Scotland must be able to make an informed choice about their future. Now, that means 2 things.
That's
it means,
called a
first of all,
referendum.
understanding what Brexit means and understanding what the consequences of Brexit are for the UK and for Scotland, and also understanding what the alternative would be, because the SNP are claiming they want a referendum because we're supposedly being taken out of the EU against our will.
Well,
and yet, in the last few days, in the last few days, it has become entirely unclear what the SNP position on EU membership is. They're suggesting that an independent Scotland would not automatically go back into the EU.
I understand
as a full
all that,
member.
Mr. Fraser,
so
but you
their
see,
entire basis for another referendum goes out the water.
I ask you about Tory policy, and you tell me about SNP policy. I know what SNP policy is, and where it isn't, I know where it isn't. I'm asking you what your policy is. If not before Brexit, would you agree to a referendum once the Brexit deal is done and dusted?
Well, what the Prime Minister said yesterday was the tests would be that we would see the consequences of Brexit and the impact of that. We would see what the SNP alternative would be. And if there was a demonstrable demand from the Scottish people for another referendum, then at that time we would consider it. But we're not going to do it before those tests are made.
All right. OK. Mr. Fraser, thank you very much for joining us from the fair city of Dundee to East Coast interviews today on the Daily Politics.
Now, shortly, Gordon Brown is going to be offering what he's calling a third option to the Scottish independence row. The former Prime Minister's intervention during the referendum campaign was seen as crucial at the time in keeping Scotland in the UK, and now he's calling for a new relationship with the EU, with powers repatriated to Holyrood. Nicola Sturgeon, meanwhile, will be warning Theresa May again in her address this afternoon that her rejection of a second referendum risks shattering the notion that the UK is an equal partnership. Our senior political correspondent Jason Farrell reports for us.
Back into the fray comes Labour's big beast, the man credited with giving a barnstorming boost to the Better Together campaign on the eve of the 2014 vote.
This is not their flag, their country, their culture, their streets. This is everyone's flag, everyone's country, everyone's culture and everyone's streets.
Gordon Brown will call for a third way, with powers returned from Brussels to Scotland, from setting VAT rates to signing international treaties and controls over agriculture, fisheries and environmental regulation. He wants a repatriation to Scotland of £800 million spent by the European Union. But this, he will say, doesn't require leaving the union with the UK.
The former Labour leader is one political figure opposed to the SNP who still has huge political sway in Scotland. And he will accuse the nationalists of not being honest about Scotland's future outside of the Union, saying it could leave the country with huge debts and detached from the UK single market.
I put this to Nicola Sturgeon.
If the UK has left the EU and it doesn't have any tariff-free deal with the EU, then you would have to have tariffs between the UK and the EU and Scotland.
This is one of the sort of scares and fears that is being touted again with no real ability to withstand scrutiny. I want Scotland to continue to trade with the UK. It's in Scotland's interest, it's in the UK's interest to continue to trade with Scotland. My point is I don't want us to lose the opportunity to freely trade within a market that is 8 times bigger than the UK market.
Today, the First Minister will up the ante in her attack on Theresa May's referendum bloc, saying to stand in defiance of it would be for the Prime Minister to shatter beyond repair any notion of the UK as a respectful partnership of equals. But her form of Scottish patriotism is now competing with that of Gordon Brown.
I don't think that Scotland should have to leave the European Union in the first place. We voted to stay, so I'm not sure that his proposals are optimal for Scotland.
Outside the SNP conference, others back Gordon Brown's intervention.
She had her opportunity 2 years ago with Alex Salmond, and Scotland, I think, in my view, spoke very strongly that they wanted to be part of Britain.
Nicola Sturgeon has accused Theresa May of puncturing Scotland's lifeboat. Brown seems to be saying the SNP's proposed vessel is already full of holes. Jason Farrell, Sky News.
Let's go live to Aberdeen and speak to our Scotland correspondent, James Matthews. James, Nicola Sturgeon due to speak there a bit later, but first, this speech that Gordon Brown's going to give a bit later, an expected intervention? I mean, we did get involved back in the first independence referendum, but I'm not sure we were waiting to hear from him quite so soon.
I think it's interesting that Gordon Brown makes his move now. You'll remember back in 2014, he came to the party very late, issuing a vow of beefed-up devolution that many thought saved the day for the Unionists just a week before the date of the referendum that time. Now he's getting in at the basement, I suppose, talking about campaigning in the coming weeks, months and along the road ahead for what he describes as a patriotic third way, federalism, effectively the middle ground that gives Scotland more powers. You heard Jason list them there: power over setting VAT rates, the power to agree international treaties, a breakup of the Bank of England that would spread its influence north of the border. So essentially, it is that middle ground that traditionally in the past, Scots, according to opinion polls, have voted for in a majority. The view here, you won't be surprised to hear, is derisive of what Gordon Brown's had to say. I spoke to somebody close to Nicola Sturgeon this morning, and he says, well, look, that was all well and good 10, 12 years ago, but if you look at where Scotland is now, specifically at a social attitude survey that was published last week that showed there's greater support for independence than there is now for devolution. So perhaps there was a day when Gordon Brown's argument would have carried the day north of the border. Maybe that's different now. Maybe that's changed in terms of the mood of the general population. But I think his entry into the fray is valuable for Unionists. He is a big hitter, a big beast of the Labour Party, former Prime Minister, of course, and associated with Labour's grand old days, if you like, not quite the same these days. But the Unionist campaign lacks a leader. It is a campaign in need of a figurehead to rally around, and perhaps Gordon Brown is the most obvious candidate from those on that particular horizon.
James, is that part of the point that maybe he's speaking so early? One of the criticisms of the Better Together campaign at the time of the first referendum was that they took so long to sort of get their house in order and make their case. Is this them getting in line early and setting their stall out fairly early?
Yeah, there was criticism of a lack of organisation, complacency, because the polls looked for so long like the no to independence vote was going to win easily, and generally it was viewed as a lacklustre campaign that needed that shot in the arm from Gordon Brown a week before Scotland went to the polls. So I think the entry of Gordon Brown into the fray cannot do that Unionist campaign any harm. I'm here at the Aberdeen Conference Centre where the SNP are gathering, of course. Nicola Sturgeon will be on her feet for the keynote speech later. And in terms of where this party goes, they will be told by their leader today that she's prepared to talk to Theresa May about a possible date for a referendum, having said she would want one between autumn 2018 and the spring of 2019. Nicola Sturgeon was saying to us yesterday, well, look, maybe Theresa May and I are not that far apart, so within reason she'd be able, or she'd be willing to negotiate. She will also say that if the Scottish Parliament votes next week to back an independence referendum, that's expected because of the number of MSPs who want independence, then if that comes to pass and Theresa May still says no referendum, Nicola Sturgeon will say, well, that is going against the will of a democratically elected Parliament and will shatter any illusion, she said, of equal partnership across the UK home nations. There is a feeling here that they are in a strong position. Having seized the initiative last Monday, people close to Nicola Sturgeon are telling me that she simply has to respond favourably to this request. If the Parliament says we want a referendum and there is still, that is still blocked by Westminster, they reckon here that will leverage sufficient support, anger, resentment, a sense of injustice among the Scottish voting population to increase their support and put them in a situation where the popular mood is overwhelmingly for independence and for a referendum, a mood that they think here Theresa May simply cannot ignore.
Just waiting to hear from the former Prime Minister, Gordon Brown. You can see, if you're watching at the moment, live pictures from Kirkcaldy. We expect him to speak in the next few moments, but while we're waiting for him, James, this potential repatriation of more powers to Holyrood, can you just describe what the Scottish Government does have full control of now, and whether the SNP, do you think, would be happy with more control over fisheries, environmental regulation, and the ability, I suppose, to maybe sign international treaties?
It's one of the key battlegrounds, actually, this business, which Gordon Brown has touched on specifically: agriculture, fisheries, environmental protection. The SNP argument with Brexit is, look, when powers are repatriated back from Brussels to the UK, they will be channeled through Westminster, and it's up to Westminster to distribute them or not. And the SNP are characterising that as a power grab, saying, look, at the moment we've got control over these areas, but when we Brexit, and these powers fall into the hands of Westminster, they won't be giving them back to Holyrood. So it's a key, you can see why Gordon Brown has touched on them perhaps specifically, as well as the other matters of setting VAT rates, setting international treaties and so on. Gordon Brown's argument is that under that federal scenario, Scotland retains strong links with Europe and also retains strong links, remains indeed, within the UK. One thing which is interesting is this notion of an advisory referendum, a consultative referendum. There has been much talk here, and indeed Nicola Sturgeon has refused to rule out the prospect of Theresa May saying no to an official, legally based referendum, and so proceeding with a referendum off her own bat, essentially, one that doesn't necessarily have a concrete basis in law. I'm led to believe that's not what they are planning. There is a fear, or they recognise the prospect within the SNP that should they proceed with that, then it is open to legal challenge and other associated problems. There could be a boycott of it, and generally it wouldn't be recognised as legally sound, and a referendum result that has any concrete basis on which to proceed. So, and it could be dismissed really as some kind of Mickey Mouse plebiscite. So that's one of the big issues here at the SNP conference. Where does the SNP go if Theresa May continues to close the door? I'm led to believe it will not be in the direction of an advisory referendum.
That's interesting, James. We are waiting to hear from Gordon Brown, probably a couple of more minutes away. So we'll come back to you a bit later, James, and hear your reaction, the SNP reaction to what he's had to say once he's got up to speak. We'll bring it to you live here on Sky News. But for now, James, thank you very much. Now, the first British troops have arrived in Estonia. It's as part of a major NATO mission to respond to Russian aggression in the region. 800 troops are going to be stationed in the country. It's the largest British deployment to Eastern Europe since the Cold War. Our defence correspondent Alistair Bunkle tells us more.
These are the first British troops to deploy to Estonia. 120 arrived last night at an airbase just outside Tallinn. They will set up a UK headquarters before the rest of the deployment arrives next month.
Well, the arrival of 120 British troops this weekend marks the start of our largest ever deployment to Eastern Europe. By the end of next month, we'll have 800 British troops with armour, with tanks, ready to help reassure our allies and to underline our commitment to the security of Europe.
Tanks and armoured vehicles have been loaded onto ships, and they are now also headed for Eastern Europe. This is all part of NATO's show of force to reassure its eastern members and to deter Russia. In total, there will be 800 British troops sent to Estonia, and they'll be backed up by a smaller French force. US troops have also arrived in Poland. Germany has sent personnel to Lithuania, and Canadian troops are taking the lead in Latvia.
The presence of NATO troops on NATO's territory is never threatened but to deter. The need to project stability outside of our borders is self-evident.
The numbers aren't huge, certainly not enough to realistically repel a Russian invasion, if there was one, but then no one is seriously expecting that. No, this is symbolism from NATO, and President Putin won't like it. Alistair Bunkle, Sky News.
OK, let's take you live to Kirkcaldy now, where the former Prime Minister Gordon Brown is talking about a second Scottish independence referendum.
We are now seeing people entrenched into extreme positions. The extreme position of the Scottish National Party, who want to be in Europe but don't want anything to do with Britain, and the extreme position of the Conservative government that want us to be in Britain but want nothing to do with Europe. I think it's become even more extreme in the last few weeks and months. The extremism of a Conservative Party that now wants what everybody now calls a hard Brexit, that is a complete exit, not just from the European Union, but from the European single market. And now we find the Scottish National Party, they also want an extreme exit, not just from the United Kingdom, but from the British single market on which so many jobs depend. Now, if it was inevitable that there were only two positions in this debate, then perhaps we would have to accept that this is the battle that we are going to have over the next few months and the next few years. But if you think about it, there is probably, and I believe definitely, a better way forward for Scotland. A better way that answers the questions and challenges raised by Brexit, these are big questions, that does more for jobs and for the health service and for public services than the two extreme options I've just mentioned, that is more in line with Scottish traditions and indeed Scottish internationalism, and is something, in my view, that can unite the Scottish people rather than having this permanent set of divisions between two entrenched camps. Now, you can call it a more federal option, as Kezia Dugdale, the leader of the Scottish Labour Party, has done with her brave changes in Labour policy that happened only a month ago. You can call it, in the more traditional way, Scottish Home Rule. You can call it federal Home Rule, as many have. I'm calling it today the third option, the Scottish patriotic way forward. But what it means is, in my view, that you can balance and you can combine the need and desire for autonomy with the obvious need, in my view, for continued cooperation in this interdependent and interconnected world. Now, what would it mean in practice? It would mean that we repatriated powers that will come from the European Union, which sadly the government and the referendum has decided that we will exit, but repatriate these powers in the main not to Westminster or Whitehall, but repatriate these powers to Scotland, its Parliament, Wales, its Assembly, Northern Ireland, its Assembly, and to the English regions. So in agriculture and fisheries and environmental protection and regional policy and in areas of employment policy, where at the moment the European Union make the decisions, it seems to me wrong that these powers should simply be transferred back to Whitehall and Westminster. Many of these powers would be better situated in the Scottish Parliament and in the other assemblies in the rest of the United Kingdom. And then take some other issues that arise from Brexit. VAT. No longer will the European Union be able to tell us what to do on VAT, and so the Scottish Parliament should be free. It's got 50% of its revenues, of VAT revenues assigned to it, to decide what the rate should be. Then take what's called state aids to industry. The European Union will no longer be able to tell us what to do on competition policy or in other areas of industrial policy to stop us supporting particular industries. Again, these are powers, a new regional policy controlled by the Scottish Parliament and not simply returned to Westminster, and the ability to support industries as well. And then take this question of our relationships with other countries. And because we are leaving the European Union, it seems to me absolutely right that if in the areas for which it has responsibility, the Scottish Parliament wishes to sign agreements or treaties with other countries on these areas, then it should be free to do so. And it would be wrong to cut off the Scottish Parliament or the Welsh Assembly or others from dealing with and having arrangements with other countries, if that is the best interest in the exercise of the powers they have. And then areas of co-decision making. I don't think it would be right that the European Convention of Human Rights or the European Social Chapter should be abandoned by a decision at Westminster without consultation and without the ability of the Scottish Parliament and indeed the Welsh and Northern Ireland assemblies to be involved and have some control over these decisions. Now, these are areas. Take Horizon, the European Research Programme. Take Erasmus, the student programme. There is no reason why we cannot, even although the decision has been made to leave the European Union, have for the benefit of universities and research and students arrangements with the European Union, as countries outside the European Union already have, like Israel. And I hope the British government will make it possible, and I hope the Scottish Parliament will have a say in this too. And so you think the realities that we have to face after this European decision, what then we do, and it leads to me saying, and I think you agreeing, that the status quo cannot be as it was, that we need to make changes. Of course, look at macroeconomic policy and the currency. And I believe that the case still remains very strong for that being part of United Kingdom decision-making in which Scottish members of the UK Parliament play their part. And of course, I have said that I think we should be thinking of the Bank of England, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, and not simply the Bank of England, because it represents and should be fully staffed in Scotland as well as Wales and Northern Ireland for the duties it has to perform. And I think the case for pensions being part of a pooling and sharing across the United Kingdom, where the risk is pooled, remains as strong as ever, as does the protection of basic welfare rights. And I think, too, that most people would agree that it makes sense for defence and security to be organised in the one set of islands that we have. And so here you have a set of proposals to deal with the new post-Brexit realities. And the biggest changes that underline the proposals that I'm making are twofold. One, if we do nothing, then there'll be a huge centralisation of power in Whitehall, and it's exactly that people in every part of the country want to get away from. If 4 billion of expenditure that is now conducted in Britain by the European Union is simply transferred to Whitehall, then that is one of the biggest power grabs that you can see. These powers should be devolved, and they should be part of the decision-making process in Scotland and in the rest of the country. But there's a second thing that's changed as a result of Brexit, and I don't think the Scottish Government is telling you the full truth about what is happening. Because in 2014, when we fought the referendum, the proposal was that Scotland, from the Nationalists, would leave the United Kingdom, but it would stay part of the British single market. Right throughout that referendum, when people argued that they couldn't join the European Union and it would take time to do, said no, they would be part of the European Union, and therefore they would be part of the European single market, and they would be part of the British single market as a result of that. So in 2014, you were being told we would leave the United Kingdom under independence proposals, but we would still be part of the British single market. That has changed entirely. If we leave the United Kingdom now as Scotland, we are also leaving the British single market. The SNP have got to face up to the fact that because England is no longer part of the European single market, and we are taking independence from the rest of the United Kingdom, then this British single market is no longer one that Scotland would be part of. That is the consequence of independence now. That is a more extreme and hardline position to exit the British single market as well as the United Kingdom. And why is it so important? Because there are 1 million of Scottish jobs that are linked to membership of the British single market. Whether they're in whisky or shipbuilding or in transport or retail or in public administration or in financial services, there are 1 million jobs. 65% of our trade is with the rest of Britain. Only 15% is with the European Union. And there are 3,000 companies exporting and importing from England, only 1,000 exporting and importing from Europe. So if we leave the British single market, which was not the proposal in 2014 of the Scottish National Party, then a more dramatic set of consequences follow. And I've always been surprised when I've heard Nicola Sturgeon speak about this. And she says the European single market is so important for jobs, for investment, for trade, for exports, for everything that the Scottish economy does. And then she cannot bring herself to say that the British single market is important for jobs, investment, export and trade. And she cannot do so even when 4 times as much trade and 4 times as many jobs are dependent on the British single market. If the issue is, as she says, jobs and industry and investment and trade for the future, then you cannot discount the 50 billions of trade we have with the rest of the United Kingdom and simply talk only about the 12 billion of trade we have with the European Union. So here we have a reason why change has got to happen, but also a reason why the change has got to be considered and sensible. The Conservatives are wrong as far as the powers of the Scottish Parliament. There has to be change, and I've just spelt out what it should be. But equally, the Nationalists are wrong to discount the fact that their extreme proposal, which is another form of Brexit, if you like, to leave the British single market, has dramatic consequences And I believe Jerry Grimson of Standard Life will be able to spell out to you, and it's up to him to say what he wants to say, but so many of our insurance and financial services and selling of pensions are Scottish firms selling into this British market, and thousands of jobs are dependent on it. So the world has changed, but it hasn't changed the way that the Scottish National Party want it to be. The world has changed in the sense that we've got to face up to the post-Brexit realities, but it doesn't make the case for independence stronger. I'm afraid it makes the case weaker, but it does make the case for what I am proposing, and I just want to spell out what it would mean. So why are we having to deal with all these problems now? Why in the 21st century, in 2017, Scotland having had 300 years of the Union, why is all this happening and coming to a head now? And I want to suggest to you, before I talk finally about what I think the implications of what I say are for the future, I just want to put this in context, because sometimes we think that what's happening in Scotland, what's happening in England with Brexit, is quite unique. Look around Europe and look in America, where I've just been recently, and all the changes that are happening there reflect similar problems that all of us have to deal with as a result of global change. In Netherlands last week, the party led by an extremist called Wilders won many more seats in the Dutch parliament, and although he didn't win a majority or will never be part of the coalition, there is a rising tide of anti-immigrant and protectionist feeling in the Netherlands. Go to France, and people think that Mrs. Le Pen will win the first round of the French presidential elections, happening in April, and although she may not win in May, the National Front in France has been making huge inroads and making huge gains with the population of France. Go to Germany, the Alternative Deutschland Party is now taken seriously as a neo-Nazi party that is trying to win popular support and won up to 20% of the vote in some of the recent local elections. Perhaps the most picturesque illustration of it is Italy. If you go to Italy now, the most popular politician is not actually a politician. He's not a ballroom dancer either, which I told Ed Balls last night. He's a comedian. The most popular politician is a man called Grillo. He heads the Five Stars movement. If there were elections in Italy tomorrow, his party would do very well. They control the mayorships of Rome and other cities. And this man, I just tell you, he is a convicted criminal. He is barred from standing from public office because of his conviction. When there was a tax amnesty, he had been campaigning against tax avoidance and tax evasion, but had to declare himself as part of the amnesty because his tax affairs were not in order, and yet he is the most popular politician in Italy. And what we're seeing across Europe, and you can go to Hungary, illiberal nationalism, you can go to Poland, where there's a more dictatorial and authoritarian government, you can go to Greece, where you've got Syriza, a party that has come from nowhere, you can go to Spain and Portugal, and you've got parties that are rejecting the status quo, the collapse of the center across Europe. And the reasons are, I believe, similar to what is happening right across Britain. That people do not see they are benefiting from global change. People see their jobs at risk. They see, in Scotland's case, of course, 1 million manufacturing jobs have gone over the last 40 years. We used to have 40% in manufacturing, and now it's only 7%. And that is happening also when people look at the prospects for their children. They do not see them as good as they thought in the past. And you've got political protests because leaders are not trusted. You've got economic discontent because people don't see where the jobs are going to come for the future, and we've got to have a message, a vision about that. And you see cultural anger and cultural discontent, and people say the country is not what it used to be, it's not what I recognize it to be. And these elements go up to an anti-globalization movement right across the world that spread to America at the time of the Trump elections. And I remember saying at another meeting here a few months ago, you know, when I went to Washington and there was a caption in a demonstration that was being held, they had a poster, and the poster said, "Worldwide Campaign Against Globalization." And you can see what people meant, but you can also see the contradictions in this, because globalization creates opportunities, but it also creates insecurity. It creates winners who do well, particularly an elite in the top industries, but it creates many, many losers. It creates a desire and a need for integration, but it also brings about disintegration. It creates probably the most popular slogan that is going, bring control back home, the same slogan that Trump was using in America and many parties are using in Europe, and was used in the European referendum and would be used in a Scottish referendum too. But of course, the world is so interdependent and so interconnected now that there is a need for cooperation as well. And if you look at all the big issues we faced, you cannot deal with the problem of pollution and environment without countries cooperating with each other. They can't break off from each other and isolate themselves. And if America does that under President Trump, there will be a huge reaction to it, because he'll have become a free rider while others are taking action to deal with the environmental pollution in our world. You need cooperation, tax, and equality. You'll never make an impact on inequality in our world unless you deal with the tax havens that operate all around the world, and they've got to be controlled by international action. Britain can't do it on its own. Scotland cannot do it on its own. The only way to bring the money back from the tax havens is international cooperation, so that you close them down and force people to act in a fair and equitable way. And then you take pandemics around the world, you can't deal with them without cooperation. If you take trade barriers that exist to prevent you trading with an individual country, you can't deal with a cooperation. If people steal your inventions in one country and use them in another, you can't deal with that without cooperation. And so the irony of the modern world is that while people want to bring back control, there is a need for cooperation that is greater than ever. And the idea that we should build barriers, and the idea that we should build walls, and the idea that we should have protectionist measures seems quite incompatible with the need to cooperate to build a better world. And I would say that when we're discussing the future of Scotland, or indeed the future of Britain, it becomes imperative to recognize that you can think of solving problems within a nation state or within a geographical boundary, but in this new world, there is no alternative but to cooperate. And however much you want to bring control back home, it's important that control of decisions is made nearer to home as possible. You have to recognize that without international cooperation, we can achieve very little indeed to tackle inequality, environmental pollution, to tackle problems affecting our prosperity through trade and through inventions and through generally making the economy work better. So in my view, the answer to nationalism in Europe and elsewhere is not more nationalism. The answer to protectionism is not more protectionism. The answer to division cannot be more division. And we have got to look at what is best for the future that we are trying to create. Now let me just explain how the third option that I'm putting forward would work. Take agriculture and fisheries. Now controlled by the European Union to a large extent, soon to be repatriated. Powers in Scotland that I would propose for the Scottish Parliament, with the resources, the money that comes from Europe that is paid out already, coming back to Scotland to do so. But the Conservative government at the moment don't support bringing the powers back. And I've got to say that the problem that the Nationalists face is that now there are no oil revenues worth the name, and now that we know there is a £9 billion fiscal deficit with the rest of the United Kingdom, that's about £1,800 per head that we have to make up. There is no money to do what we need to do. Under my proposals, we keep the Barnett formula, we keep the fiscal transfers, but we also bring the powers to deal with agriculture and fisheries back to the Scottish Parliament. So you have the powers and you have the resources. The Conservatives won't give you the powers, the Nationalists can't raise the resources. We can do both. And if you take shipbuilding, 6,500 jobs in Scotland. And the way forward is that we have the power, if we needed be, to help that industry if we choose to do so. We keep the orders that are mainly British defence orders and don't lose them by leaving the British single market. Again, the Conservatives will not give us the powers, and the Nationalists don't have the resources. Take the financial services. Here's another example. The financial service, 100,000 jobs directly, 100,000 jobs indirectly. Now, I said the financial services depend on trading with the rest of the United Kingdom. Most of the jobs are dependent on selling insurance and pensions and other services to neighbours in England, Wales and Northern Ireland, and that's where the jobs come from. Now, under our proposals, we stay in the British single market and don't leave it. We have more powers for the Parliament to take action where it's necessary, but we don't lose the advantage of being in the single market. take North Sea oil. Huge problems ahead because of the rundown of jobs in the North Sea, because of the price of oil and the inability to invest. I've always favoured that we take action, and if we're in the British or the Scottish Parliament, so that we can have partnerships with these North Sea companies to keep
We're going to leave Gordon Brown there at the moment. He's speaking live in Kirkcaldy. If you missed any of it, he's essentially outlining a third option for Scotland rather than independence or a hard Brexit. He's saying that they should effectively get some of those repatriated powers that are going to be taken away from Brussels during Brexit and implement them in Scotland. Things like fisheries, agriculture, environmental issues and the ability to sign treaties as well. But he's not just talking about Scotland. He's mentioned that that could be the way forward for Wales, maybe even London, certainly the Northern Ireland Assembly and the regions of England as well. So a slightly different way to approach Brexit and Scottish independence that Gordon Brown is outlining. So we'll leave him there.
OK, we're just going to have to come out of the pledge there to take you live to Aberdeen, where Scotland's First Minister Nicola Sturgeon is about to speak at the SNP conference.
Conference, I'm aware that this is not the only important event happening in Scotland today. And no, I'm not talking about Gordon Brown delivering the same speech again. I am of course referring to our magnificent rugby team. Let's congratulate them on an outstanding Six Nations performance. Friends, it's great to be here in the Granite City, to look out at a conference hall packed with so many people from all walks of life and from every corner of our country. You reflect the strength and depth of the SNP. You are a reminder that other parties might appeal to one section of our community or one part of our country, not the SNP. We are a national party with a truly internationalist outlook. Our priority now and for the generations who come after us is to build a better Scotland for everyone who lives here, no matter where you come from. Often in these times, I am reminded of our dear friend, the late Bashir Ahmad. Bashir came to Scotland from Pakistan in 1961 to work as a bus driver. 46 years later, he became Scotland's first Asian member of our national parliament. The very first time he addressed an SNP conference, Bashir articulated this simple message. It's not where we come from that's important, he said. It's where we are going together. And today, with the forces of intolerance and xenophobia seemingly on the rise across our world, Bashir's words have never seemed more appropriate. Let us rededicate ourselves today to the spirit of that message. Inclusion, tolerance, diversity. Let's make these the foundation stones of the better Scotland we are seeking to build. Friends, it is great to see so many of you here today. But I hope you will forgive me, because my speech this afternoon is not really aimed at you. Of course, I could be going out on a limb here, but I'm assuming I already have your support. I'm assuming that you need no persuading that Scotland should not be dragged out of Europe by a Tory government intent on a disastrous, hard Brexit. And I'm guessing that you're already convinced that Scotland has what it takes to join the family of independent nations. Well, that's a relief. Friends, our job is not to talk to each other. It is to reach out to those not persuaded, to put ourselves in their shoes, to understand the hopes, fears, and ambitions of all our fellow citizens, and to do what we can to establish common ground. Always remember Bashir's words. Carry them with you in your heart. What matters is where we are going together. These words don't just apply to how we treat those who come from other countries. They must apply to how we treat each other, all of us who live here and call Scotland home. We all want the best for our country. We just have different views on how to achieve it. As Scotland's government, we bear a special responsibility to offer a hand across these differences, to build consensus where we can. So let us resolve to argue our case with passion and commitment, yes, but at all times with courtesy, understanding and respect. In that, as in everything else, it is my job to lead you by example. That is why I speak today, not just as SNP leader to our party conference, but as the First Minister to all of Scotland. I know that the plan I set out on Monday was music to the ears of SNP members and independent supporters up and down the country. And let me set out again what that plan is. After the terms of Brexit are clear, but while there is still an opportunity to change course, the people of Scotland will have a choice. There will be an independence referendum. But I also know that for every one of us who is full of excitement and anticipation, there will be someone else feeling nervous and anxious, perhaps even resentful. In the last few years, it has been one big decision after another. You have been bombarded with statistics, claims and counterclaims. You might have had heated discussion with friends and family. Even though you may feel, like we do, that 2014 was a positive and vibrant exercise of democracy, you might not relish going through it all over again. I understand, that. So I want you to know that I did not reach the decision lightly. Indeed, for months I have strived to find compromise and agreement with the Prime Minister. Despite our overwhelming vote for Remain, the Scottish Government accepted that Scotland within the UK would leave the EU, but that we should seek to retain our place in the single market. We proposed substantial new powers for the Scottish Parliament, short of independence, that would help protect Scotland's interests in a post-Brexit UK. But instead of meeting us halfway, or frankly, any of the way, Westminster chose to dig its heels in. Our efforts at compromise with the Prime Minister met with a brick wall of intransigence. And you know, that is a concern that should resonate far beyond Scotland. The Prime Minister's attitude should worry all of us, hoping that negotiations with Europe will not be a disaster. Because, and let me put this bluntly, if she shows the same condescension and inflexibility, the same tin ear to other EU countries as she has to Scotland, then the Brexit process will hit the rocks. Of course, that's the outcome that hardline Brexiteers are agitating for. But it would be in no one's interests. So as Article 50 is about to be triggered, let me say this to the Prime Minister. Stop putting the interests of the right wing of your party ahead of the interests of the people of our country. For me, though, the Prime Minister's refusal to budge an inch meant that I had to make a decision. I could have taken the easy option. I could let Scotland drift through the next 2 years, hoping for the best, but knowing that the worst is far more likely. Waiting for the chance to say, I told you so, knowing that by then it might be too late to avoid the damage of a hard Brexit. Or I could make a plan now to put the Scottish people in charge of our own future. I choose to put the people in charge. The fact is, our country stands at a crossroads. The future of the UK looks very different today than it did 2 years ago. We know change is coming. The only question is what kind of change. And on that, we are not powerless. We can still decide which path we take. Whatever our different opinions on independence, we can all unite around this simple principle. Scotland's future must be Scotland's choice. Which brings me to the Prime Minister's statement on Thursday. To stand in the way of a referendum would deny us that choice. It would mean that the path of our country was determined not by us, but for us. Decided by an increasingly right-wing, Brexit-obsessed Tory government. A government that some predict will be in power now until 2030 and beyond. Thanks, in no small part, to the embarrassing shambles of an opposition that Labour has become. A Tory government dominated by the likes of Boris Johnson and Liam Fox, deluding themselves about rebuilding the empire and refloating the royal yacht Britannia. It seems they want to go back in time. But it's not just nostalgia for empire that they're keen on. They clearly long for the days before we had a Scottish Parliament. The days when Tory governments could do anything they wanted to Scotland, no matter how often they were rejected by the voters. The days when they could impose the poll tax, destroy Scottish industry and deny all demands for constitutional change. Well, the Prime Minister should understand this point and understand it well. Those days are gone and they are not coming back. Next week, in line with the mandate secured at last May's election, we will ask the Scottish Parliament to agree that the Scottish people should have the right to choose our own future. We will ask Parliament to agree that this choice should be exercised at a time when we know the terms of Brexit, but before it is too late to take a different path. And we will ask Parliament's permission to seek the legal authority that will allow the people of Scotland to have that choice. If a majority in the Scottish Parliament endorses that position, the Prime Minister should be clear about this. At that point, a fair, legal and agreed referendum on a timescale that will allow Scotland an informed choice ceases to be just my proposal or that of the SNP. It becomes the will of the democratically elected Parliament of Scotland. To stand in defiance of that would be for the Prime Minister to shatter beyond repair any notion of the UK as a respectful partnership of equals. She has time to think again, and I hope she does. If her concern is timing, then within reason I am happy to have that discussion. But let the Prime Minister be in no doubt. The will of our Parliament must and will prevail. Of course, the Tories' reluctance to allow Scotland a choice isn't really hard to fathom. They are now terrified of the verdict of the Scottish people. They know, as well as we do, that what is at stake in the years ahead is not just our place in Europe, important though that is. What is at stake is the kind of country we are going to be. With independence, the country we become is up to us, all of us who live here. We can choose to be a compassionate country with a big heart and a helping hand for those in need. An open country that doesn't pull up the drawbridge and look inwards, but one that encourages the best and brightest from around Europe to make Scotland their home. And not just from the goodness of our hearts, but for reasons of hard-headed self-interest as well. Scotland needs people to want to work here, in our businesses, our universities, and our public services. Of course, people have concerns about immigration that need to be addressed. I know that from my own constituency. But as we decide the kind of country we want to be, we must be clear about the choice on offer. For the current UK government, ending free movement comes before everything else, including the health of our economy. It is their #1 priority. And make no mistake, for Scotland, the result will be lower living standards and a hit to our prosperity. So not just for the sake of our values, but for our economic future as well, it's time to take a different course. It's time to stand against the demonisation of migrants and to stand up for those who choose to join us in building a better Scotland. Of course, we don't yet know exactly what the Tories want a post-Brexit UK to be like, but there are two recent developments that point the way. Last year, under pressure, David Cameron accepted what was called the Dubs Amendment. It committed the UK to providing a safe haven for unaccompanied child refugees, some of the most helpless and vulnerable people on our planet. But last month, the UK government called a halt to the Dubs scheme. They said that their new approach to refugees was absolutely right. Well, I beg to differ. I think it is absolutely wrong. It is inhumane and it must be reversed. The second issue is the status of EU nationals. Men and women who have built lives, families and careers here. People who, overnight in June last year, lost all certainty about their futures. You know, it's a depressing commentary on the state of British democracy that it took the House of Lords to do the right thing. But fair play to them, they did. They secured an amendment to the Brexit bill guaranteeing the right of EU citizens to stay in the UK. It is even more depressing that the Westminster government then whipped its MPs in the House of Commons to overturn that guarantee. It is indefensible. You cannot lecture others about politics not being a game while you are using the lives of human beings as pawns. Let me make this clear to everyone across our country today. In an independent Scotland, the SNP would guarantee unequivocally the right to stay here for all EU citizens who do us the honour of making our country their home. Compassionate, open-hearted and hard-headed, that's the kind of country I want Scotland to be. We must be resourceful and enterprising as well. No one owes Scotland a living, but we are more than capable of earning our own success. In the debate about our future, you, the people of Scotland, deserve to hear us speak frankly about the challenges facing the Scottish economy, the challenges of independence and the challenges we will face under an austerity-obsessed Tory government pursuing a hard Brexit. We should embrace that scrutiny. Opponents of independence, as is their right, will make their case by highlighting what they see as the difficulties. It will be up to us to demonstrate how these difficulties can be overcome. But as we do so, let's never, ever forget this. We have the strongest foundations on which to build. advantages that few nations can match, unrivaled energy resources, some of the world's best universities, strength in finance and business services, cutting-edge expertise in life sciences and advanced manufacturing, a truly world-class food and drink industry, and the best tourist attractions anywhere in the world. Well, almost the best. According to Rough Guide, we are actually the second best country in the world to visit this year, but we are aiming for the top spot. The point I'm making is this. As we debate our future, let's do so openly and honestly. But let no one, for or against independence, ever seek to run down Scotland's strengths and our nation's great potential. What we must all do is strive to make our country even better. So when we look at a fiscal deficit created on Westminster's watch, let's decide that allowing Westminster to keep making the same mistakes over and over again is not the best way to deal with it. Instead, let us be a country that works out how to build, grow and innovate our way to a stronger and more sustainable future in a way that keeps faith with our own values of social justice. A country that makes its own choices, like choosing to invest in public services and a brighter future for our young people, not in a new generation of nuclear weapons. Our Growth Commission is currently working on a clear plan for Scotland's economic future. The Commission will conclude its work over the next few months, and we will then present its outcome for public scrutiny and debate. It will address the challenges we face in a hard-headed and realistic way, but it will also set out the massive opportunities we have as a country if we choose to grasp them. You know, since the Brexit vote, I've had loads of messages from people in other parts of the UK asking if they can move to Scotland. Now, I'm sure many of them are joking, but if any of you are listening today, there is a serious point. The UK is about to turn its back on membership of the world's biggest single market. Imagine what will happen if Scotland chooses to stay. We will become a magnet for talent and investment from all across the UK. So let me issue this open invitation today. Scotland isn't full up. If you are as appalled as we are at the path this Westminster government is taking, come and join us. Come here to live, work, invest or study. Come to Scotland and be part of building a modern, progressive, outward-looking, compassionate country. It is down to us to make the economic case for independence, to answer clearly the questions that people ask, and we will. But we should also be clear about this. Those who argue for Scotland to stay in the UK have big economic questions to answer too. we know that down that path lies austerity, cuts and the impact of leaving the single market. The Westminster government is now even openly threatening a race to the bottom in tax, wages and working conditions. That is no basis for a modern economy. The kind of economy we are seeking to build is founded on a different vision, not a race to the bottom, but investment to lift people up. That is our plan, not just with independence, but in the here and now. Since we took office, Scotland's productivity, so crucial to our economic prospects, has grown by almost 10%. Productivity in the rest of the UK has grown by just 0.1%. So we have a good record, but we have more to do. Key to our success will be digital skills. You know, it's estimated that if we make better use of cloud technology and big data, the benefits to our economy could be over £5 billion a year. Recent studies estimate that we need more than 12,000 new workers with digital skills every year. And yet only a quarter of businesses report that they are doing anything at all to develop the technology skills of their current workforces. We need to change that. Scotland can't afford to lose out on the digital revolution. So I can announce today that we will establish a new 3-year, £36 million support fund to meet the upfront costs of digital skills training, helping businesses to invest in their staff and build our country's future. A strong economy is the basis for strong public services. In a few weeks' time, people across the country will make their judgment on who should run local services. The Tories have based their entire campaign for these council elections on denying the people of Scotland the right to choose our own future. Our campaign is all about improving Scotland's communities. And here we have a very clear choice too. Last month, our budget invested hundreds of millions of pounds of extra resources in local services. The Tories voted against that budget because it didn't deliver a tax cut for the highest earners. Same old Tories, tax cuts for the richest and just cuts for the rest. So my message today is clear. Don't let the Tories get their hands on your local services. On May the 4th, vote SNP. We work to build a better Scotland every single day. In May, as well as contesting these council elections, we will mark 10 years of our SNP government. I am proud of the work we have done, but I know we have much, much more to do. Today, I want to thank everyone up and down the country who works in our public services. I want to thank particularly those who work in our National Health Service. And today, there are more people working in our health service than ever before. You know, the additional staff employed since we took office would fill this auditorium 6 times over. And that is necessary. With populations getting older, pressures on health services across the world are intense. Nowhere, perhaps, do we see that more clearly than in our accident and emergency services. But there we also see the commitment of our NHS professionals. In Scotland, 90.8% of patients are seen within the 4-hour target. That's still not as good as we want it to be, but it is better by a significant distance than any other part of the UK. In England, the figure is just 77.6%, more than 13 points behind Scotland. Perhaps someone should have informed the Prime Minister of that fact before she had the brass neck to lecture us about governance. But we have more to do. One of the challenges that our NHS faces is the increasing number of people seeking support from mental health services. Actually, that is a welcome development. It shows that the stigma that stopped people asking for help in years gone by is now fading. But it places an obligation on us to invest more in services to meet that need. Over the next few weeks, we will publish our new 10-year mental health strategy. That strategy will focus not just on traditional mental health services. It will look at what we need to do across the NHS and in wider society too. For example, we know that GP surgeries and A&E services are often the front line for mental health. And outside the NHS, we know that too many who end up in our prisons and our police cells have mental health issues that go untreated. We want to change that. So let me outline today just some of the action we will take. We will increase the mental health workforce, giving access to dedicated mental health professionals to all of our A&E departments 24 hours a day, to all of our GP practices, to every custody suite in every police station and to our prisons. In total, we will increase the budget by £35 million over the next 5 years to support the employment of 800 additional mental health workers in our hospitals, GP surgeries, prisons and police stations. Providing healthcare to those who need it is one of our most important responsibilities. But I have made clear that the defining mission of our government is education. I believe Scotland as a country has the right to choose our own future. But we must also make sure that the people who live here have the means and opportunity to make choices about their own lives. That means building a country where every child can make the most of their talents. We are determined to close the attainment gap in our schools. But we know that life chances are far too often determined before a child even starts school. Doubling the provision of high-quality, state-funded childcare, as we intend to do in this Parliament, is therefore a key part of our plans. Rightly, when we talk about the childcare revolution, we focus on the benefits for children and parents. But there is another benefit. Delivering our pledge will involve the recruitment of thousands more people to work in our nurseries. We need to demonstrate how much we value this work. I'm very proud of the steps our government has already taken to extend payment of the living wage. We have led by example in the public sector, and we have encouraged businesses to see the benefits not just for their staff but also for their bottom line. I can confirm today that we intend to apply that approach to our expansion of childcare. In public sector nurseries, staff already receive the living wage, but there are currently around 1,000 private nurseries helping to deliver our free childcare policy, and currently around 80% of the childcare staff who work in them don't earn the living wage. That's 8,000 people in total. There are few more important jobs than caring for our youngest children. So I can announce today that by the end of this Parliament, we will invest £50 million to ensure that all staff working in private nurseries delivering our childcare pledge are paid the real living wage. Friends, we can do all these things to improve the lives of the people of Scotland because we are in government. And it is a privilege to serve. That privilege to serve is something we should never take for granted. We must earn and re-earn the trust of the people each and every day. The opportunity to serve our country in government was something that past generations of SNP members could only dream about. but it is down to their efforts that I stand here before you as First Minister. When the story of our party and of Scotland's independence is written, it will be those who worked so hard against seemingly impossible odds who will take centre stage. And there is little doubt that one person and one date will stand out. Winnie Ewing, 1967. Exactly 50 years ago this year, Winnie won the Hamilton by-election and made this famous declaration: "Stop the world, Scotland wants to get on." Let those words resonate today. We are a European internationalist party leading a European internationalist country. We will make sure that our voice is heard here at home, and we will stand up for Scotland's values abroad. And one of those values is self-determination, an unshakable belief in the sovereign right of the people of Scotland to determine our own future. Last week, I had the very sad honour of speaking at a memorial service for one of the greatest advocates of that principle, the late Canon Kenyon Wright. When he chaired the Constitutional Convention, Kenyon posed this question of the then Tory government's opposition to devolution. What happens, he asked, if the other voice we know so well responds by saying, "We say no, and we are the state"? His answer to that question, so relevant again today, was this: well, we say yes, and we are the people. Friends, as we go forward, we must work to win the support of the people and the communities that we serve. We must always work to build a better Scotland for everyone who lives here. We must stand up for our country and always trust the people. As we approach this crossroads in our national life, let us resolve to give Scotland a choice. Let this message ring out today. Scotland's future will be in Scotland's hands. Thank you very much.
OK, you've just heard from Scotland's First Minister Nicola Sturgeon speaking at the SNP conference, where she reiterated that there will be an independence referendum. Now, this despite the fact Theresa May, the Prime Minister, has said this is not the time for a second referendum. She's insisted and called for Theresa May to stop putting the interests of the right wing of her party ahead of the interests of the people of her party, that's Nicola Sturgeon's party, but reiterating, speaking to members of the SNP, saying that there will be, according to her, a second referendum on independence. Now, this is set to be debated in Holyrood next week, where she is expected to get that vote in Holyrood for there to be a second referendum. She should get the backing of the Green Party. But today, speaking to delegates, she explained why she had to push forward for this independence referendum, saying she spoke to Theresa May. She felt that Theresa May wouldn't compromise. Theresa May wasn't flexible. And she did admit that actually, obviously, they don't know the terms the UK will get following a UK Brexit out of the EU, but did say that as far as she was concerned, she got a good idea in terms of what that would mean to Scotland, but essentially explaining today why she is pushing for that second independence referendum.
Now let's take a look at the European Court of Justice.
Seems to bring the ECJ into line broadly with where the UK government is, as far as I can work out. You can't discriminate against one particular culture or religion. You must treat equally and fairly all, and I think that probably is broadly where we stand.
But Theresa May made it clear at PMQ she really disapproved of the ruling. She said that women have the right to choose how they dress. That's not quite what the ECJ ruling is saying.
Well, what she's saying is she wouldn't legislate on how people are going to wear it, on their costumes. That's absolutely right. But if there is to be some restriction upon the front-facing element, then all should be treated equally and fairly.
What do you make of it?
Well, first of all, we shouldn't be under the jurisdiction of the ECJ.
No, I got that bit from you. Right. But what do you make of the principle?
Well, it's fraught with difficulties because, as they pointed out in their judgment, first of all, it's about should a company have a dress code, and that's not an unreasonable thing. But this judgment's fraught with difficulties because it would also mean that people can't wear Jewish skull caps, Sikh turbans, Christian crosses. I think what's far more pertinent is not about headscarves, but about having a policy on face coverings so that you have the same rule for everybody, whether they be in a public building or a private building.
Is that, you raise an interesting point there. Is that right, you think, that Sikhs would not be able to wear turbans at work?
No, that's not how the ruling sets out at all. What it's actually doing is, again, it's giving the power to particular companies to treat all its employees fairly. If it's going to try and look at one in a certain way, it looks at them all that way. But the point is, it's not.
Yeah, but if it said we want no religious symbols at all of any kind, would the Sikhs then be in trouble with the turban? Because I understand it, the turban is part of the is a religious manifestation for
The
Sikhs.
point is that the ruling is very clear. That company would have to justify very clearly why it was making that statement, and if it cannot justify that, then it cannot impose that. As far as I'm concerned, that seems practical and sensible.
Interesting development. We'll see what the national and the lower courts make of it, because a lot of the judgment in the end was saying that this really, the details need to be sorted out at a national or local level. Now, yesterday the bill enabling Theresa May to trigger Article 50 and start the negotiations, which will end with Britain's exit from the EU, got the royal assent. Downing Street has said that the Prime Minister will trigger Article 50 at the end of the month, probably the last week of the month. So what will happen next? European Council President Donald Tusk has said that he would need just 48 hours to respond to the UK with draft guidelines for the negotiation. Tusk has also said an extraordinary meeting of the EU 27, that's the EU without the United Kingdom, will take place in April or possibly May, where European leaders will decide a guideline for the negotiating mandate. Only once the mandate is agreed will the official negotiations begin, maybe sometime in June or July. There's lots of elections getting in the way of this in Europe, with citizens' rights and the Brexit divorce bill likely to be top priorities. Both sides need to reach an agreement by October 2018. You heard George Robertson, Angus Robertson, I should say that, leaving enough time for the UK and European parliaments to sign off on the terms of the deal. Though, of course, European talks often go way beyond their deadline. If there's no agreement, there is then a chance that the UK could, to use the vernacular, crash out of the EU on world trade terms. Brexit Secretary David Davis said on Wednesday that the UK government had not assessed the economic impact of such an outcome, he said, quote, to my satisfaction. Donald Tusk addressed the issue when he addressed the European Parliament on Wednesday.
I want to be clear that a no-deal scenario would be bad for everyone, but above all for the UK, because it would leave a number of issues unresolved. We will not be intimidated by threats, and I can assure you they simply will not work. Our goal is to have a smooth divorce and a good framework for the future. And it is good to know that Prime Minister Theresa May shares this view.
Are you surprised, or does it matter that the government, given that it said this could be an option, that no deal would be better than a bad deal, has not sort of game planned what no deal would mean?
Yes, I mean, considering that we've done it, I can't see why they haven't done it.
Have you done it? What way have you done it?
Well, you talked about WTO terms. I mean, the big issue here is about trade. There's no way you're going to unravel the tens of thousands of EU laws before you leave. But on trade, they just need to be made a simple offer, which is that they can have continued tariff-free trade with 3 of their 4 freedoms: goods, services, capital. But they can't have people, because we are going to control our border.
Well, WTO doesn't cover people.
No, I know it doesn't, but we could offer them that option, and then it would be in their interest to do it, because this would be a decision of the Council, by the way, whether they do this. And then Mrs Merkel would have to answer to the German car makers, the French president, to the wine growers, to say why they were not accepting a deal to do that, but would prefer to have the common external tariffs put up. So it's actually something that could be done in 10 minutes and decided in an afternoon.
Are you surprised, though? I mean, that's the principle, but it doesn't tell us what the economic consequences would be. Are you surprised that the government's not done this yet? Or is economic modelling so discredited after what was said before the referendum vote that it's not worth the candle?
I think right now they're focused on what is the positive and constructive case. And I've no doubt, again, they will have to look at all scenarios. But right now, first and foremost, must be to get the best deal through the negotiated settlement. And again, I suspect certain elements this will happen faster than others. I think it will be a multi-track approach to these negotiations. There are some things which are straightforward and some things are devilishly difficult.
Well, will it be multi-track? Because Michel Barnier is who's going to head up the negotiations on the EU side, or at least one of the major figures there. He's saying, look, we need to agree the divorce bill before we talk about the post-Brexit relationship between the EU and the UK. The British government, particularly David Davis, seems to be saying, no, we need to talk about both at the same time. That could be a deal breaker if the Europeans don't agree to that.
The whole thing is fraught with difficulties, because there is a report being prepared by the Economic and Monetary Affairs Committee, which is putting all kinds of impediments up already, so we believe from a draft, which they want the ECJ to have continued control and jurisdiction. They want to control our tax policy. And the man in charge of the negotiations is Mr. Verhofstadt, who is the most enthusiastic integrationist that you'll find in the whole Parliament. So he's not got any... Well, he's the Parliament spokesperson, if you like,
but he's not
on
in
this
charge. He's a senior... Is he not a senior observer on the matter?
He will be an observer.
On behalf of the Parliament?
On behalf of the Parliament, he will have no negotiating role whatsoever.
Oh, no, right.
And the lines which are being described here, of course, are every single one of those committees is doing that. Of course they are. That's what they want. They want the hardest possible deal imaginable.
Well, no, actually, the fairest one I've read is from the Constitutional Affairs Committee, which actually gives quite a fair exposition of where we are and what could happen. I don't necessarily agree with all of it, but for example, one of the things they say in there is that we're under no legal obligation to pay any money into the budget.
Well, that was the House of Lords had said that too. What other committee said that
The Constitutional Affairs Committee.
Of the European Parliament?
Yeah.
All right. Do you think it would be a deal breaker if the Europeans stick to the current line, which is you need to agree the divorce bill before we talk about our future relationship? The British government is not going to go down that route, is it?
Well, as far as I'm concerned, the first thing you say in a negotiation is the hardest possible line, and you put that on the table. Of course they're going to say that. The bottom line, if it is indeed a deal breaker, the problem is for the EU. They need the money from the UK full stop. Without it, there's a huge black hole.
Money has become a bigger issue now, hasn't it?
Much bigger. And the point is, the continuing programmes right now, French farmers right now will need money. Where's it going to come from if it's not going to come from the UK during that period? The last thing they need is the UK walking away from the table, because if that happens, French farmers are going to be an awful lot.
Let me ask you just very briefly. Do you buy this rather sanguine approach that we will have, in effect, the shape of the deal by the autumn of 2018? I mean, in all the summits I've covered in European negotiations, they always go down to the wire.
I think we've already got it in a way, because Mrs May is not going to repeal a single EU law. She's not going to amend a single EU law before we leave. And she's then going to incorporate the entire body of EU law into British law. So what changes?
So you think it can be done by the autumn?
Well, I think you could end up with a deal which I wouldn't support, because we wouldn't have actually really
I'm just talking about the timetable. Do you think it can all be done?
They certainly can't renegotiate every EU law by then. It's impossible.
Do you think it can be done by then, to give time for the European Parliament, the Scottish Parliament, the British Parliament, everybody else to have a say?
And it will have time. The divorce, I believe, can be done within that period. Of course, the other element is the trade deal itself.
Right.
That part, indeed, could take longer, and I think there's no point for anything otherwise. But the bottom line is the divorce structure, settlement, and all of these elements can be mapped out in a 2-year period.
But in many ways, the trade is the easiest thing, as I've just described.
Very well. We shall see. All to play for. What is the future direction of Europe, if there is a future? Following the shock of Brexit and the election of the openly hostile Donald Trump, will the EU come closer together, or is the path forward one of looser cooperation? It's a big debate in Europe at the moment. MEPs in Strasbourg have been looking at the 5 options laid out in a Commission white paper, as Dan Johnson has been finding out.
Rome, 60 years ago, when Europe's future was first mapped out. Many of those original principles still guide it today, but there have been bumps in the road, and this week Europe's leaders started discussing a new direction.
The idea of a multi-speed Europe will be one of the discussions ahead of the Rome anniversary. And I understand the reasons for this. Some expect systemic changes that would loosen intra-EU ties and strengthen the role of nations in relation to the community.
But which way to turn? How best to get an agreement? And are they serious about change?
I think certainly the Brexit decision has given a push in order to go into this direction, and finally it has also reached the Commission and some of the other political groups in this House that we do need to reconsider some of the things and some of the ways that we have done politics in the past in the European Union.
So 5 options to be considered. Carrying on, essentially nothing changes. Cutting back to nothing but the single market, already effectively ruled out by the Commission. Those who want to do more would allow closer integration for some, while others moved at their own pace. They could all do less more efficiently. Or they could agree on doing much more together. The leader of Parliament's second biggest group knows what he wants.
The best scenario is the 5th scenario. The possibility to go home, to go forward together for more European integration, political integration. The majority of the people understand that we need a stronger, a more united Europe.
It just so happens Mr. Patella was previously a forensic pathologist, so that begged an obvious question.
I don't think that Europe is a dead body.
Thank you, Doctor. There does seem to be acceptance that Europe has lost its way in recent years. At least there is now a pause to reassess and look for a new way forward. But to actually get anywhere, everyone has to agree on the best route. They're hoping to do that by the end of this year, but that could be a tough ask. Jean-Claude Juncker has already discussed his plan with the German Chancellor and Spain's Prime Minister, but some Eurosceptics don't like any of the alternatives on offer.
I feel like many other citizens completely betrayed. These options are just one option with different degrees. Let's exclude the first one because the first one is keep everything like it is, and in fact we are seeing that it's not working. The second one is just focus on the market, but the Commission said we do not want this option. The other 3 are just 3 different degrees of integration. But the point is integration for what and to do what.
Is this the way to actually get people to love Europe again?
I think that there needs to be a bottom-up European movement. I think we as pro-Europeans need to go to the streets again and say we want this, because in so many countries there has been this narrative of the European Union being something of the elites, being something top-down, and I think we need to show no, this is not true.
So the challenge is to gather new momentum and get back on track. All aboard then, even if we don't yet know exactly where we're heading. All except the UK, of course. Whatever the new destination is, Britain won't be along for the ride.
Now, you would have thought that the prospect of Britain leaving the EU, which is a huge historic event, whether you're for or against it, it's a massive event in the history of the EU, would have concentrated minds in the EU to say, all right, where do we go from here without Britain as the EU 27? But it seems to me that they're as divided as ever on the way forward. Is that right?
Pretty much spot on. Everyone's pointing in a different direction and shouting forward. The plan that was put forward by Juncker was interesting because it was like the magician's trick with one card sticking out, which was the multi-speed Europe, the twin track or multi-track. That's the one that seems to be gaining some sort of credence now. Everyone seems to like that if they're in the fast lanes. Those nations that are in the slow lane are very unhappy with it.
That includes the East Europeans?
Oh, yeah, very much.
And to some extent the Nordics as well.
As well. So what you ended up with is a scenario in which those who are in the fast track see why that's important. Those in the slow track are wondering how they would ever get into the fast track then.
And the other thing, of course, is that the elections, we've just had the Dutch election, and that has produced a result which I suspect will take a long while to form a government now in Holland. We've got the French ones coming up and the Germans. I mean, a France that is run by Mr. Macron and a Germany that's run by Mr. Schulz, both of them very strong European integrationists, would have a very different direction than a France run by Madame Le Pen, or continues to be run in Germany by Chancellor Merkel. Is that not right?
Well, exactly. So they can't sort this out quickly. The most sensible option would be the one that they've discounted, which is number 2, which is just to concentrate on tariff-free trade and turn the EU into...
Well, maybe then you would have wanted to stay in?
Well, we want tariff-free trade, but I don't think we want the rest of it. But that would be the most sensible option for them.
But they're not going to do that, are they?
No, they aren't. And in fact, although Mr. Juncker said at the end of his speech that he wasn't going to say what his preferred option was, I think most of us kind of guessed it was option 5. And deeper integration all round.
There are, I mean, the elections this year are fascinating for a number of reasons, but including this, because as I say, Mr. Macron is a very strong pro-European. That's his approach to things. Mr. Schulz is a very strong European too. But in Italy, 4 out of 5 of the biggest parties are now against the euro.
Yeah.
Now, they haven't as yet had an election this year, but they might, we don't know. And the East Europeans are a whole different ballgame too. It's quite difficult to see the way forward with all these differences of opinion.
The only thing that seems to bring Europe together right now is discussing Brexit. That's
Is that right?
The only thing that unites them. Curiously enough, however, a lot of these populist movements might not win elections, but they're dragging the debate onto their side of the pitch.
As they did with Mr. Rutte in Holland, who had to move on an anti-immigration.
And so you're going to see a lot more Eurosceptical elements being front and centre in a lot of these campaigns. So the complexion of Europe is going to change even if they don't win
Is it in our whatever path they take, and it will not be our decision, because apparently we're not going to be there, but whatever path Europe does take, is it in our interests that, given that it is still our biggest market by a long way, is it in our interest that it should succeed?
I think it's in our interest that it doesn't go into an economic meltdown, because that would be very bad for everybody. But of course, there's a tremendous disaster waiting on the horizon, which is what happens to the euro. In the report that Mr. Juncker did, I was amazed when I read it. It said we have to do something about the catastrophic rates of youth unemployment. In the second paragraph, it said, and we must deepen economic and monetary union. And they just don't understand that one of the biggest causes of the economic problems in Europe, not all of them, but one of the main causes, is the European single currency.
But he's talking about trying to make the monetary union work more sensibly with a proper banking union and with transfer payments from the richer countries to the poorer countries.
They want full economic
The difficulty with that, given the Dutch election, is that reforming the euro is now going to be more difficult than ever.
Absolutely. And the point is, there's not a common problem, so there isn't a common solution. There are lots of different problems dragging in different directions, causing a huge problem right now for Commission and all the rest.
And the 2019 European elections could see a lot more parties like UKIP, when we're gone, being elected across Europe.
Much more fractious.
Well, you'll be leaving space for them. Now, divorces can be messy, and if you fall out in a big way over the money, for example, it can make it very difficult to make new arrangements. So how can a messy Brexit breakup be avoided? Our Adam's been to the former Czechoslovakia to look at what can be learned from what came to be called the Velvet Divorce.
Picture the scene. It's New Year's Eve 1992 and this square is packed with people celebrating the end of Czechoslovakia and the birth of an independent Slovak republic in a process known as the Velvet Divorce. So called because not a single shot was fired. In Bratislava Castle, evidence of where it all started. Handmade signs from the protest that overthrew communism in 1989.
Together. Freedom Europe.
Right. But the public weren't as involved in what happened next.
The main contender here is the HZDS leader, Vladimir Mečiar.
Slovak nationalist Vladimir Mečiar was the victor in elections in 1992. Over an intense few weeks, he negotiated a split with his counterpart in the richer Czech half of the country. There was no referendum, and the divorce followed a simple formula.
There are 10 million Czechs, 5 million Slovaks, plus minus, so property was divided 2-1, military was divided similar way, diplomatic service and our embassies were divided sort of very peacefully, and we didn't have any border disputes. So because we always had border between Czech and Slovak republics, so I think that there were no major fights.
Since then, Slovakia has joined the EU and flourished. Or has it? Iveta Radičová is a member of the former Prime Minister's Club with David Cameron. She says the split was undemocratic, left her country briefly bankrupt, and was harder than people remember.
Some things were really solved 10 years later, not immediately, not at all. All new state institutions, president, parliament, government, justice, court, constitutional law, all institutions of controlling mechanisms, everything.
For the next generation of politicians, like the economy minister, it's all ancient history. Or geography.
I think we are with Czech Republic in best partnership with other neighbor countries.
Still good friends.
Still good friends.
I'm not the only visitor from the UK. The Brexit Secretary David Davis was in town recently too. Could he have spied any lessons for the UK's upcoming divorce?
Openly, no lessons.
It will be a long process. I don't think it will be over in 1 or 2 years.
Key is to maintain goodwill and maintain good relationship where you are not playing game and tricks.
It's a triumph of nationalism and not much else, as the two republics go their separate ways.
Watching another famous correspondent who stood on this spot, the lesson I've learnt is that separating seems massive at the time, but living apart lasts for much, much longer.
I did reporting from Bratislava. During the Scottish referendum, I did a documentary about breaking up, and we looked at the Velvet Divorce. Although it involved two pretty small countries, and you think it'd be relatively easy, it turned out it was hugely. There were scores of treaties that had to be done. Breaking up is hard to do.
Yes, but I think the lesson there is if you made the decision to go, and sort the details out afterwards.
And
if you try and sort the details out before, you won't end up going anyway.
But that's not really the government's position, is it? The British government's position. I mean, and it may not be acceptable to the British people. Before we go, we want to see what it means.
Well, there are certain things I believe we can untangle very quickly. Other things actually involve us building something afresh. So there are two elements to this, which is a new relationship as well as a severing of the old. I believe we can do that if we both enter the discussions in the right frame of mind, knowing that harming one side harms the other side too.
Can you look to negotiations in which there's no victor and no vanquished? Can that be done?
In terms of the trade thing, we make them an offer they can't refuse and we all benefit. And as you've said, that seems to be the biggest issue. The rest of it can be sorted out. It's not going to be immensely difficult. The immigration is the next biggest problem.
Are you as sanguine as that?
It can be done, but we've got to keep focused on the outcome, and that is a good deal for both sides. And that's what the people of Europe actually want. Whatever their politicians want, that remains to be seen.
We shall see. It's going to be a very interesting time. I thank you both.